So a reminder, I'm Tony Burns. I'm one of the co-directors for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's seminar, which is a book launch. It's devoted to a book, recently published book by one of my colleagues, Andreas Bieler, who's a fellow co-director of the Centre, and Vincenzo Maccarrone. So we've got 90 minutes roughly. Usually we have half the time devoted to the seminar paper and the other half of the time devoted to the discussion. Tonight's a little bit unusual because several of the contributors to the volume, the critical political economy of the European Polycrisis, are going to spend a few minutes talking about their individual contributions. So I'm going to leave a discussion of what the book's about to Andreas, and perhaps to introduce the fellow contributors as well to Andreas. I'm just going to say a little bit about Andreas himself and Vincenzo, just by way of an introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Andreas. So Andreas is, in addition to being a fellow co-director, he's a professor of political economy in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. His general area of expertise is international relations and international political economy, with a particular interest in the dynamics of global capitalism, neoliberal globalization, and European integration, all of which he looks at from the perspective of a particular version of Marxist historical materialism. Andreas is also particularly interested in the question of possible effective resistance to unwelcome developments that are taking place in these areas, usually associated with some form or other of neoliberal globalization or restructuring. He's particularly interested in the role of labor movements and the possibility of establishing relationships of transnational solidarity across borders. He's published a lot, so I'm not going to bore you with I'll just mention a couple of books: Global Capitalism, Global War and Global Crisis, which he wrote with another colleague, Adam David Morton, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, and more recently, Fighting for Water, Resisting Privatization in Europe, which was published by Z Books in 2021. Now, I don't know that much about Vincenzo. I've only just met him, but I do know a little bit. I suppose, relatively speaking, compared to Andreas, he's a fairly junior academic, if you don't mind my saying so. He was awarded a PhD in employment relations at the University College Dublin in 2020. So he's been researching and writing and publishing for the last 5 years or so. He was a postdoctoral researcher for the EU, focusing on labour politics and collective action and EU economic governance between 2021 and 2023. He was a global I can't pronounce this, so I won't bother, Curie Fellow at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence and at Cornell University in New York between 2023 and 2026. He's currently an assistant professor, again, in the Scuola Normale Superiore at Florence. He was appointed last year, and that's what he's up to now. He's published a lot, but again, I'm not going to give you the details. That would be tedious. His research areas are European economic governance, industrial relations, trade union strategies, labour politics in the EU, the gig economy and labour organising, and transnational labour governance. And considering he's only been at it a few years, his list of publications is actually quite impressive. You can check that out on Google Scholar. So tonight's seminar is just an introduction to this recently published edited volume, and I'm now going to turn on critical political economy of the European Polycrisis, and I'm going to turn over to Andreas, and he's going to introduce the volume and the fellow contributors, and they will be saying a little bit about their individual chapter contributions. So over to you, Andreas.
Yes, thanks a lot, Tony, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. So this is about the book launch of the critical political economy of the European Polycrisis, and rather than Vincenzo and me providing a 40-minute long presentation about the various chapters, we thought actually it might be best if we have a few of the contributors talking about their contributions themselves. And so what I'm going to do is to talk a bit about the purpose by way of introduction underpinning the volume. We then have our 4 contributors, and I will introduce them one by one when it is their turn. And Vincenzo will then complete the book launch with an overview of the key findings across the whole volume. Now, just let me share my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. I trust you can see the slides.
Yes, that's fine.
I see some people nodding. Thank you, Tony.
You need to actually run the PowerPoint. Yeah, that's it.
There we are. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So the purpose of the volume is twofold. So on the one hand, it was Vincenzo who approached me at the conference in Napoli in 2023 and told me, well, is it not about time that we have an update from a critical political economy perspective about recent developments related to European integration? And I will show in a moment there have been a string of books, edited volumes across the years. And indeed, when we think about the current situation Europe finds itself in, by many referred to as polycrisis, the multiple crises, whether it be in the security area, here we have the war in Ukraine, be it in more economic areas with COVID-19, and then of course how those crises are interrelated, that seemed to be a highly appropriate moment to have a reassessment of European integration. The second purpose, however, was also to address some of the theoretical blind spots of earlier critical political economy analysis of European integration. And in my short introduction, I'm going to talk briefly about both of these purposes. Okay, over the year, as I mentioned, there have been a number of edited collections analyzing European political economy from a European integration from a critical political economy perspective. And actually, when we look at the various volumes, 8 overall, some of the contributors to the most recent volume have been editors of earlier volumes or contributors to earlier volumes. So there's a certain continuity when it comes to those edited collections, but there's always also some novelty. Yeah, so we have some more established academics who contributed to the edited collection, but we also have newer, younger academics who have joined the fold and produced work on European integration from a political economy perspective. And so really, this edited volume, The Critical Political Economy of European Polycrisis, needs to be seen in line of these earlier edited volumes. Now, with all these volumes, there are a number of common conceptual assumptions underpinning them. And the whole area, this critical political economy of European integration, and initially it was often referred to as the Amsterdam School of transnational capitalism, or actually a neo-Gramscian perspective of European integration. These initial engagements with European integration to some extent drew on the work of Robert Cox. You see on the right-hand side the cover of his book of 1987, as well as on the work by Kees van der Pijl, The Making of the Atlantic Ruling Class. It was those two books which inspired those initial critical political economy engagements with European integration. And key here was that there was a focus on the contents of integration, not the form. Why was that important? Well, throughout the 1990s, there was a raging debate between intergovernmentalists, state-centric approaches on the one hand, and liberal neo-functionalist approaches on the other, competing with each other about predicting how the form of European integration was going to unfold. Yeah, with the intergovernmentalists asserting no, states will always be the main decision makers, and neo-functionalists arguing there will be an ever closer integration, an ever closer union emerging. What was completely missing in those debates was a focus on the social purpose, the contents underpinning these latest steps of European integration, especially from the mid-1980s onwards. And the critical political economy, the neo-Gramscian perspectives, they established that it was really neoliberal restructuring which was driving the revival of European integration from the mid-1980s onwards. Another commitment was vis-à-vis historical materialist analysis of class struggle. Of course, different authors in their slightly different ways, but nonetheless, there was a common understanding that a Marxist, a historical materialist approach would precisely allow us to focus on the contents of European integration. Of course, a Marxist approach focuses on class struggle, mainly between capital and labor, but what is distinctive about this approach is also that there's a focus on the struggle between different class fractions. And of course, there has always been a focus on an emancipatory project. The focus on the normative underpinning of European integration, the social purpose around neoliberal restructuring, was the starting point of a critical engagement with the direction of European integration, and therefore also the starting point to reflect about potential alternatives. However, looking back at the literature, I think we can argue that there have also been a number of theoretical blind spots. It was already in 1972 that Walter Rodney published his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But when we look at these neo-Gramscian transnational historical materialism approaches, the colonial legacy of European integration was really not engaged with. It was a clear theoretical blind spot. Racial capitalism, this literature was not taken into account. In 1974, in Italy, feminist political economists launched the Wages for Housework campaign. But again, looking back at European integration analysis, unpaid labor in the sphere of social reproduction did not really feature as a major issue. And I remember myself giving a keynote lecture at a conference, being then asked why I would not have a feminist analysis incorporated into my analysis of European integration. And I remember how I thought back at the time, but hold on a second. I mean, I'm already the critical person here engaging with the mainstream neo-functionalist intergovernmentalist debate from a Marxist perspective. Why should I take on board a feminist approach? Looking back now, of course, this colleague was spot on. That if we do analyze European integration from a critical political economy perspective, we must also engage with the issue of unpaid labor in the sphere of social reproduction. And clearly this was a theoretical blind spot back then. Equally, the Limits to Growth publication report was already published in 1972. Nonetheless, the ecological destruction of our environment was not really part of these critical engagements with European integration. This is where nowadays eco-socialist perspectives guide us into an additional direction. So it's a number of additional theoretical critical approaches which have been overlooked in the past and which we attempted to bring on board in this most recent edited collection. So looking at the overview of the volume, there are 5 different parts. Of course, the fact that we cover or try to cover the theoretical blind spot does not mean that the traditional critical political economy perspective is no longer valuable. And part 1 especially has a number of those contributions. But, and we will hear from Nico in a moment himself, part 1 also includes a much closer focus on racial dynamics when we deal with the migration policy of the European Union. Part 3 is especially dedicated to the ecological crisis and European integration. We have part 4 looking at various dimensions of European foreign policy and how patriarchal and racist dynamics are interrelated into developments in this particular sphere. And part 5, then we look at critical political economy of the rise of the far right in Europe. I argued that these critical political economy approaches always have had this emancipatory project underpinning them. So when we think about how things develop in the future, of course, we cannot simply engage with progressive wishful thinking, but we also need to take into account the concrete regressive reactionary political dynamics. And part 5, especially in this volume, is dealing with this aspect of European integration. So that brings me to the end of this very short introductory overview of the volume, the main purposes underpinning the volume. And next, I would like to give the word to Nikolai Huke. He will introduce this chapter. Nikolai works at the University of Hamburg in Germany, and he leads the research project Labor Rights in Precarious Living Situations. Nico, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I'll just share my slide and see if it's working. Is it working? Can you see it? Perfect. Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to present my chapter towards a critical political economy of migration, borders, and racism in the European Union. I'm happy to be here today and also to be part of the book. I've been reading quite a few of these edited volumes when I was a student and also a young researcher, which is some years ago. But I haven't been so engaged in these debates on European integration in the last years. It's actually been quite a few years since I've been engaged in these debates. So I was happy to be asked and also happy to be part of one of these edited volumes now. Yeah, it was thanks Andreas and Vincenzo for thinking of me and also for the work as editors. What I'm doing in my chapter is a pretty straightforward argument. Or maybe it's 2 arguments. The first argument is I've looked through these edited volumes. I've done a keyword search and just looked for migration, racism, borders, and related keywords. And the first observation that's pretty obvious, pretty easy to make, is that not much is written actually on migration, racism, and borders in these books. And my argument in the chapter is that this causes not only an empirical problem, because an important part of European integration connected to Schengen and so on, that has always been a driver of European integration, European security policies and so on, is actually not looked into that deeply as other topics, parts of European integration. But this leaving out of migration, racism, and borders also causes deep theoretical flaws, I would say, that can be seen in these parts of the books where something is written about migration, racism, and borders. And my argument would be that what is written on migration, racism, and borders in critical political economy approaches to European integration actually falls short of the more general critical political economy debates on those topics. And my key findings you can find in this table that I've brought you today. The talks should be brief today, so I just kind of give a broad overview of these findings. And what one can see if one contrasts what is written in this European integration CPE approaches on migration, racism, and borders with the broader CPE debates on those topics, is one can see that in European integration CPE, migration tends to be seen primarily as a resource for capital, for example, human capital that can be imported, or also as a tool for deregulation, for weakening labor standards, for deregulating welfare states, and so on. Borders are seen mainly as a tool for capital's regulation efforts. It can be used quite instrumentally. Racism is mainly reduced to xenophobia, interpersonal racism, whereas structural dynamics of racism are rarely taken into account. The conceptions of labor tend to conceptualize the interests of core workers in core European countries as general labor interests. So when something is written about labor, what is generally meant, or most often meant, are the interests of core workers in core European countries, which is, of course, not all labor, because there's a lot of more labor than just core workers in core European countries. Other than that, there's a rather passive conception of labor. We've done some work on this in the Disrupting the Critical Political Economy of European Integration book. And the focus on global social inequality focuses mainly on negative effects of neoliberal globalization, while leaving out other topics. I will show that in a minute. And my argument in the paper or in the chapter is that these misconceptions, I would say, lead to quite problematic assumptions regarding struggles on welfare and also questions related to authoritarian populism. So some authors, at least, tend to see within these European integration critical political economy debates, tend to see the struggles around welfare. They tend to see these national welfare states as meritocratic orders that is based on rights and obligations, a view that is highly questionable if one takes into account global capitalism and the inequalities written into global capitalism. On the other hand, authoritarian populism tends to be seen by quite a few authors as a form of social protection against capitalist disembedding. Also a view that I argue in this chapter that is both empirically problematic and theoretically problematic. On the other hand, if one looks at this broader debates on migration, borders, and racism, for example, in debates on racialized capitalism, one can see that migration there is seen as an obstinate labor struggle for social reproduction. Borders are seen as material condensations of social forces, that is more complex effects of social struggles. The focus on racism lies more on racialized patterns of capitalist accumulation, regulation, and exploitation, that is forms of structural racism. The view of labor is a lot more complex and takes into account the conflicts that exist within labor, between different labor fractions, and also the alliances that are formed between certain labor fractions and certain capital fractions. So you can really see these fragmented interests and continuous struggles between fractions of labor, and labor becomes visible as a living labor. And also the view of global social inequality is more, I would say, complex maybe, because it shows the relatedness of global patterns of consumption, accumulation, exploitation, and the destruction of livelihoods, for example, in the concepts of the imperial mode of living. If one shifts the theoretical perspective in this way, it also changes the view of how one can understand welfare. National welfare states become visible as dependent on borders, stratified rights, and uneven developments of capitalism, connected to injustice, of course. and authoritarian populism becomes visible not so much as a form of social protection, but more as a brutalized form of capitalism that is based on the defense of imperial privilege and connected to struggles at the borders of racialized capitalism. This is kind of the two arguments I want to make in this, or I make in this chapter. The first is not much is written on migration, racism, and borders in European integration, political economy, and the other is what is written falls short of the general debates of critical political economy. So what I would consider necessary to overcome these theoretical shortcomings is a more thorough engagement with these debates on migration, borders, and racism. And I think this is something that, especially in the context of the current polycrisis, the rise of authoritarian populism, and so on, is not something that can be done, but something that must be done, because otherwise the generally really productive conceptions of European integration, political economy, these neo-Gramscian perspectives, they tend to produce empirically and theoretically problematic understandings of what is going on at the moment with regards to the authoritarian shifts that one can observe in the context of European integration. Yeah, so I think, yeah, that's why I think this is necessary. And yeah, this is kind of what I wanted to argue in this chapter, and it's kind of deepening on this this theoretical blind spot of migration and borders. That's it for me.
Excellent. Many thanks, Nico. Perfect timing. It was our first chapter contribution, which we introduced this evening. And without further ado, I'm directly moving forward to our next presenter, Giuseppe Montalbano. He's a postdoc at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Luxembourg. Giuseppe, over to you.
Good evening. Can you hear me? I hope yes. First of all,
Very
thank
good.
you. It's a
And we can see
pleasure
you.
for me to be here, to be part of this great edited book, and to be here this evening to give you a short overview of our chapter, which is about the critical political economy of housing and residential capitalism in general, and why and how it is important to understand general dynamic of capitalist crisis and the European polycrisis. And sorry, I cannot put my slide. Okay, now it's working. This chapter and this edited book actually gave me and my co-author, Professor Lindsay Flynn at the University of Luxembourg, the opportunity to summarize our main arguments and explanatory mechanism we developed in our research project on the importance of housing policy dynamics and the impact of housing policy dynamics on social inequalities in a European comparative perspective. And we try to summarize this argument situating the current housing crisis, because we know now the housing question and related affordability crisis came up again in the political public agenda. We try to situate the current housing crisis in terms of a more general dynamic of capitalist crisis, and also a crucial factor to understand the European polycrisis. So how housing and the political economy of housing must be conceived at the same time as a result and a further engine of capitalist crisis, and an actual point of intersection of multiple economic, political, and social crises. We then try to reconstruct the driving forces and contradictions of neoliberal housing policy and how they trigger crisis dynamics. And we try to do that, of course, trying to develop, building on literature on critical political economy, in particular the critical political economy of European integration and neo-Gramscian literature, trying to construct a critical framework to understand the political economy of housing, also trying to foster a dialogue between neo-Gramscian approaches and neo-Marxian literature on residential capitalism. Why a critical political economy approach to housing? In our chapter, we also discussed the current mainstream literature on housing between financial geography, political economy, and political science more in general, and as in the tradition of no Gramscian works on European integration, we try to detect the main blind spots and limits of mainstream approaches, in particular some of approaches developed from the 70s and the 80s. To be short on this point, there are two main ways to study the political economy of housing. One more, so to say, analytical and empiricist, focusing on investigating the actual structure of housing provision. That means the way housing is produced, distributed, and consumed in different national and local settings. And this kind of stream could be criticized, according to us, for the lack of a kind of explanatory ambition, the lack of an actual causal mechanism, explanatory framework to understand how these different forms of housing provision actually work. And also, the main limit is that this approach is delinked from an understanding of capital accumulation and social struggle. On the other side, there are more theory-led approaches, the so-called housing regime approaches, and the varieties of residential capitalism approaches, trying to understand how specific factors shape overall dynamics of housing provision developments, focus on either on the structure of housing tenures or specific forms of housing finance, like in the varieties of residential capitalism, which is important because it shed light on the importance of financialized way of providing housing to understand overall developments, particularly in the post-war context. But even from this point of view, there are clear limits related to a kind of theory-led approach, which sacrifices the complexity and differential factors shaping residential capital accumulation dynamics in favor of a few, focusing on few variables. And then we'll also try to confront our approach with more heterodox one, like the one developed by Halbers, the literature on housing financialization. In our opinion, this literature also has some limitations related to the kind of empiricist bias, lacking explanatory ambitions, and the more recent stream and research on residential accumulation, which, in our opinion, neglect the specific and distinctive role of the state and the political dynamics. So we try to put forward and make the case for a kind of neo-Gramscian approach, also in studying residential capitalism. That means, in particular, trying to understand the mutual relationship, interactionship between structural, socioeconomic, and political dimensions. And so we try to see at the same time the role of structural factors, how residential environment under capitalism represents a crucial factor in a kind of rent-driven accumulation, which shapes the current dynamic of capitalist development in general, and also considering the work of David Harvey, which is a crucial reference from this point of view, understanding how housing is a specific sector of the building environment shaping what Harvey and Bob Jessop called the spatio-temporal fixing dynamic of capitalist crisis. But these structural factors interact with specific socioeconomic housing-related pattern of inequalities and class struggles. From this point of view, we try to see how these structural factors shape kind of class-based housing dynamics, identity construction, and collective action intersecting with gender and ethnic dimensions in social reproduction. And lastly, this...
2 more minutes.
I'm going to conclude being faster. The political dimension is related to the what in the Gramscian literature is called the hegemonic projects, how this different socioeconomic fraction related to housing shape overall interest and views interacting with the political class and the state in constructing competing hegemonic projects as current patterns. I switch some other slides just to focus on how, considering these three different dynamics, the post-COVID housing reforms reveal some limits in the way socioeconomic actors and policymakers try to fix the different crisis-led tendencies in residential capitalism, led by an expansion of the private rental sector and dynamics of rent-driven financialization, particularly after the global financial crisis. There has been, of course, rising dynamics of rising housing unaffordability, rising prices, and unaffordability ratios, growing politicization of housing issues and social mobilization, pressures to strike a new balance between housing as a financial asset and as a social right. At the same time, the post-global financial crisis housing policy increased the dependence of housing provision, public housing provision, on private investments and market actors, fostering the importance, in particular, of financialized actors like asset manager and institutional investors, in a way that the structural power, what we call the real estate finance complex, is critically narrowing the state response capacity within the same neoliberal hegemonic project. So putting in question the capacity within the neoliberal capitalist relation, so to say, to foster a kind of viable hegemonic compromise between competing housing-related classes. And that was the main message of our chapter. We provide some examples of some reform attempts in Europe and their main limits. You can find it in the chapters. And thank you again for your attention.
Brilliant. Thank you, Giuseppe, for the very concise overview of your contribution to the volume. Our next speaker is going to be Rosalind Cavaghan. And Rosalind is a visiting fellow at the University of Edinburgh, as well as independent consultant. Rosalind, over to you.
Okay, you can see my slides? Great. So thanks very much for having me presenting here today. You can see from the title of my presentation that I'm maybe not looking at the Green Deal from the angle that you would initially expect, because I'm actually asking whether it's going to solve the European crisis in social reproduction. So because I'm not at a feminist conference, I'm going to start by laying out exactly what I mean by social reproduction and why I'm focusing on the Green Deal's potential impact on it. So when feminists talk about social reproduction, what we are describing is all of the inputs that go into maintaining society and producing labor itself. So some of those inputs come through public spending, things like education, collectivized healthcare, or childcare. And it also includes all of the care services that families purchase. So for example, like nannies or cleaning. But a really large proportion of social reproduction takes the form of unpaid labor, like the caring that you do for your children or checking on an elderly parent. And the value of unpaid social reproductive, or SR labor, as I'll call it for the rest of the presentation, that has been calculated by the United Nations as being worth up to 43% of GDP in wealthy European countries. So the SR sector is enormous, and it is the foundation on which the productive economy rests. And it has a huge positive impact on collective human welfare. So that's like the foundational starting premise of feminist political economy. But the EU has a long and illustrious history of both ignoring and simultaneously exploiting the SR sector. If you look in EU economic policy documents, the SR sector is rarely discussed explicitly, and it is consistently misrepresented as though it is a drain or it is a waste of resources. So an example of this would be the way that so-called second earners, people who work part-time due to caring responsibilities, they are often discussed in EU economic strategy as economic underperformers, people who should increase their hours of employment. And since the financial crisis, EU countries have, of course, implemented austerity, which means they've been cutting the public services which people rely on to, for example, watch their children after school, or to care for their elderly parents. And the impacts of that have been studied extensively in feminist EU studies. And we know as a result that we have a crisis in SR in Europe because the sector simply isn't resourced enough and too much is being dumped on specific categories of people, which is mostly women and people with a migration background. So they do really large amounts of unpaid or poorly paid precarious labor to meet these SR needs, which are ultimately non-negotiable. So the SR crisis is also a justice issue because EU economic policy is what has dumped all of these burdens onto people. But don't despair, because in addition to tackling the climate crisis, the EU's Green Deal promises that it's going to be just and inclusive, and that it's going to put sustainability and well-being of citizens at the center of economic policy. So the concept of sustainability that the EU is putting forward in the Green Deal embeds two agendas in the heart of EU economic strategy: environmental stewardship and also social justice. And that's what prompted me to look at one of the central mechanisms implementing EU economic strategy, the European semester, to do a qualitative analysis in the hope of finding a transformation in the way that SR is treated. So our starting point is, we know that there's a crisis in SR in Europe. We know it's been created through repeated rounds of EU economic strategy. Is the Green Deal going to move us towards a sustainable SR sector? So in the chapter, I describe 5 different shifts that I would want to see that would imply we're going to get to a more sustainable situation with SR. I'm not going to go through those due to time constraints, and to be concise, I'm just going to touch on 3 indicators just to give you a flavor. So I'm going to talk about how the negative impacts of EU economic policy are now discussed, whether the SR sector is properly described, theorized, and whether we see an effort to redistribute SR burdens. So if we compare how social impacts were discussed before the Green Deal versus after it, we do actually see a difference. So the negative impacts of austerity after the financial crisis, they were presented as if they were both necessary and unavoidable. And interestingly, they were even kind of justified on the basis that pain now is going to enable a future inclusive economy. And the people who were impacted at that point were very negatively described, and they were presented as if they were just inherently vulnerable. So there was no acknowledgement in these policies that, well, of who was hit and how and what the role of policy decisions actually were in that. But if we look after the Green Deal, there is a change, because there are many statements that the cost of the green transition should be cushioned and should be redistributed. And this is taken so seriously, in fact, that it is presented as though not doing so would be a potential threat to Europe and European cohesion itself. And we also see after the Green Deal that there's a much clearer identification of who will be vulnerable to these negative impacts. The vulnerable subjects are actually identified as people working in specific sectors and specific states. So on the face of it, there seems to be a more energetic approach to dealing with social impacts. But if we look specifically at whether SR is explicitly acknowledged as a valuable sector, which it is necessary to recognise and support, we are going to be disappointed. The SR sector is still not properly represented as an actual economic input or as a foundational economic sector. And if you look at what social inclusion actually means, it is really a very hollow concept. It's actually just a byword for increased employment. There is no meaningful recognition of the hugely unequal SR burdens which have been created by years of austerity. And there's no effort at redistributing those burdens. Tellingly, the only place where we do actually see concern for unequal contributions relate to pensions. So we do see economic strategy talking about the need for some people to contribute more to their pensions, and that's sold under the guise of intergenerational fairness. But this is the only time when we see unequal burdens in SR contributions taken kind of seriously in any measure. So underneath the promising rhetoric, which we do see after the Green Deal, there is more commitment to cushioning the negative impacts of the EU's economic policy, but that concern for the negatively impacted does not extend to people who are suffering the consequences of previous iterations of economic policy. And it does not extend to people with disproportionate SR burdens. In fact, the SR sector is still barely mentioned, and it is absolutely not recognized as a foundational economic sector. And that's what leads me in the chapter to put forward the three rather punchy conclusions that the EU's notion of sustainability in all of its senses, which works for everyone, does not include social reproductive sustainability. And it's not going to work for everyone. And unfortunately, the crisis in European social reproduction looks set to continue apace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosalind. Perfect timing, which now leads me to give the word to our fourth contributor, Alan Cafruny. He is the Henry Platt Bristol Professor of International Affairs at Hamilton College. Alan, over to you.
I'm trying to work out how to stop sharing. What do I have to click?
If you press on the share button, there should be, it worked.
Oh, it's gone.
Rosalind. Perfect. Alan.
All right. Thanks, Andreas and Vincenzo, for a great edited volume. And it fits very well in the long string of great critical political economy. My co-author, Vasilis Fuskas, and I address in our chapter a central feature of the polycrisis, and that is the acceleration of Europe's relative decline and deepening subordination to the United States. Now, a lot has happened since we wrote the chapter, and so I'll take up some of the issues that aren't in the chapter, but certainly would have been and were predicted by what we wrote. For example, the Greenland conflicts within NATO, the possibility of actual military conflict within NATO, threats of punitive tariffs, and much else. So it's important to recognize that this transformation is more pronounced in the Trump era, but in fact, the underlying contradictions and conflicts within the transatlantic relationship have been developing for decades, and important respects crystallized under the Biden administration. So if Trump goes, it's not clear just exactly what would change. Okay, so our chapter generally addresses what Mario Draghi called Europe's existential crisis, economic stagnation, and we focus explicitly on Germany, formerly the crown jewel of European economic prowess. Then we contextualize this within the context of the war in Ukraine and implications for EU and NATO and the transatlantic relationship. Explicitly in its national security strategy, back in December, the first draft, which was leaked now, but actually advocated seeking to break up the European Union. So that really gives a pretty good indication of U.S. policy. So we start out with a range of statistics on Europe's quite staggering economic decline relative to the United States. And this, in great part, accounts for the consequent subordination. I don't have time to go into very much, but just two statistics. In 2008, the UK and EU economies were about equal to the USA in GDP By 2023, U.S. economy 1/3 larger. And I think maybe even a more telling statistic, the 7 largest U.S. tech firms are 20 times larger than their 7 European counterparts. And the market value of these 7 large U.S. tech firms is about the same as the combined GDP of Germany, UK, France, and Italy. So starting off on Andreas's wonderful presentation of all the great edited books on Europe was Ruined Fortress back in 2003, and I think we could say the United States is in the fortress now. So things are developing just as many critical political economy scholars predicted. Okay, German decline, it's been profound. It's industrial base declining. This has been years in the making. It's almost certainly irreversible outside of militarization that Germany could recover. And of course, it was dramatically deepened by the Biden administration, subsidies, industrial policies, and the sanctions on Russia. By far the most significant factor, the massive increase in energy costs for Germany and Europe as a whole, resulting from the sanctions on Russian energy. The cutoff of Russian gas was sheer madness. Germany was never dependent on Russia, but now is dependent on the United States. And the United States is making the Germans and the Europeans pay for this in all sorts of ways. The destruction of Nord Stream was an act of war by the United States on the Europeans and on Germany. Also, of course, by Ukraine and quite likely Poland. The Trump administration, one of its core interests is energy dominance. And now Germany really is dependent on the United States, which provides natural gas at much higher prices, increasing infrastructure costs all the way down the line. Okay, so where is Germany heading here? This is where it gets pretty interesting, shall I say. As we all know, a clear drive towards mercantilism and corresponding militarism, a vast increase in the German military budget, said to prepare for war with Russia by 2029, conscription possibly, and military budget tripling up from 22 to 29, and now 4th largest in the world. This will further degrade the welfare state and exacerbate social tensions and nationalism. It's clearly motivated by military Keynesianism. The only way the debt brake could be overcome. Rheinmetall shares have increased 20-fold. So you have all of this, and now calls for tactical nuclear weapons in Germany. The German director of strategy at the German Armed Forces Command and Staff College proclaimed Germany needs its own tactical nuclear weapons. Okay, so by way of conclusion, just 3 days ago, a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs. You all know Foreign Affairs is the Bible of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And the title is Europe's Next Hegemon. What does this mean for Europe and for the world? Liana Fix is her name. And she starts out by recalling Thatcher and Mitterrand's concerns over German reunification and suggesting that maybe this wasn't such a good idea. She then quotes Lord Ismay, his famous statement, NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and Germany down. Well, NATO is collapsing now. And the concern is that Germany could reprise in political military affairs its coercive and predatory response to the Med in the Eurozone crisis. Therefore, Europe's next hegemon, Germany, Europe returning to fundamental imperialist rivalries. So this is pretty dramatic. One could say it's, but coming from the foreign affairs, I thought it was really interesting, and it really coincides with this much broader development. I would say that the fact that it comes from foreign affairs indicates the divisions in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. She sees this, but she's worried about it. But of course, from the standpoint of the Trump administration, this is policy, where the potential collapse of NATO empowers Russia, which the United States doesn't mind, and therefore allows the United States to shift its focus to Asia. But it also gives rise to intra-European rivalry, which is also something that the United States doesn't mind. Okay, so I've gone a little bit farther than we went in the chapter just because of these new developments, and I hope that's something that we can talk about.
Thanks a lot, Alan. And now the final word to my co-editor, Vincenzo. He's going to present some of the findings which come out from the various contributions across the volume. Vincenzo, please.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay.
You are not yet in presentation mode, but...
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So, first of all, let me thank you everyone for coming, and also thanks all the authors. It was really a pleasure to work with all of you throughout the entire genesis of the book. And I think, as Alan actually explained quite well in his presentation, it's not easy to publish a book on the European Polycrisis, also because it tends to evolve so quickly. But we also think that it is exactly this multiplication and acceleration of crisis which makes the development of a critical political economy of the European Polycrisis especially urgent. We also think that critical political economy approaches offer a powerful antidote, to cite some of our colleagues, against the risk of situationism, which overlooks structural explanation of a phenomenon's origins. And they allow us to go beyond the conjuncture of the present and reveal the broader underlying dynamics which have resulted in the current shifting landscape of multiple crises. So I'll try. It's not easy because there are many chapters in these books, but I'll try to summarize some of the common threads and findings. And the first one is really that we see a continued hegemony of neoliberalism in Europe. Alan and Vasilis in their chapters notes how the COVID-19 pandemic necessitated actually anti-ordoliberal policies, but at the same time, other chapters also highlight how, for instance, EU industrial policy, rather than being geared towards progressive objectives, remained mainly an instrument to open new frontiers for the accumulation of capital, while fiscal policy keeps subordinating social objectives to the need to provide a stable macroeconomic framework. This is Magnus Reiner's chapter. We see in different chapters, like the chapter by Costanza Galanti and Stella Christou, and the chapter by Dara Golden, how this EU macroeconomic governance framework that Rosalind was describing still exercise a commodifying pressures also on new fields like healthcare or local public services. And at the same time, the chapters also show how European neoliberalism emerged as a multiscalar and a variegated phenomenon. And we have chapters on Italy, for instance, by Daniela Caterina and others. The chapter by Elif on Turkey clearly show this. We heard from Nico about the key role of race in capitalist relation of production, but at the same time, we acknowledge that even critical political economy has been late in acknowledging the role of both gender and race in shaping capitalist relation of productions. Rosalind has highlighted already how, for instance, in the wake of the pandemic, the unequal distribution of social reproduction duties between men and women has increased. And while the EU macroeconomic governance framework acknowledged more, the role of social reproduction, it still does it with an economicist lens. And while capital accumulation increasingly rely on unpaid labor, at the same time, there is an impulse to commodify other spheres of social reproduction, like housing, like Giuseppe so well explained in his chapter with Slave Flynn. And also, we have another chapter by Stephanie Hull on housing in Vienna. And again, healthcare appears also as a key source of capital accumulation recently. We have several chapters, and I think this is important, of course, dealing with the question of the EU and the ecological crisis, because capital exploitation does not only rely on unpaid labor, but also on cheap natures. The European Green Deal, which was already cited by Rosalind, is analyzed through different lenses. We see how it is essentially a form of privatized Keynesianism 2.0, with the mobilization of private finance and the energy industry, which initiate a new cycle of capital accumulation. And while EU green finance might have a reformist element, as Eva Zivok and Johannes Jäger also highlight, at the same time, they also note how, even within this field, neoliberalism remains dominant. There is also the fact that EU green policy is essentially based on a relationship of unequal exchange between the core, in this case, the EU, and peripheral countries. We have chapters on, for instance, Chile, the Mercosur agreement that Andreas analyzed, and also the failure of EU attempts to regulate this through the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And finally, we also, building on actually the neo-Gramscian tradition, we note that while neoliberalism remains dominant in Europe, there are, of course, competing hegemonic projects. I just mentioned how, for instance, this reformist element of the EU green finance. But these reformist efforts essentially will fail if they do not challenge the fundamental way in which production and actually social reproduction are organized. There were some instances of successful popular mobilization led by unions and social movements that we report throughout the book. But at the same time, I think the book also acknowledged the reality, which is the more successful counter-movement in Europe has been the rise of the far right. And of course, we have various chapters analyzing the effort of far right parties to organize and become hegemonic, although at the same time, we show how there is still a lack of cohesion of far right hegemonic projects throughout Europe. Ultimately, we conclude by saying that critical political economy analysis will remain important for tracing future European integration and uncovering the cracks and contradictions within the capitalist European political economy, which in turn might provide space for resistance and progressive alternatives. I'll stop here. I just conclude by showing that the book does exist also in physical form. And if you are, if you do work in an academic institution and you can, please order the book for your library. And yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vincenzo. And that just leaves me with the task to pass back to my colleague Tony for the overall chairing.
Okay. Tony. Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you all for your contributions. So we have about 20 minutes or so for question and answer. If you want to make a comment or ask a question for anybody, could you put your electronic hand up so I can see? Or I've tried the chat, and we think the chat is working. So if you're shy and don't want to actually speak, you could write it in the chat, and I'll read it out. But hopefully, and if you could switch your cameras on, that would be great. Actually, we'll have this seminar feel. It's always nice to be able to see people's faces, isn't it? Catherine, I can see you've got your hand up. Very good, thank you. Hello, welcome. Over to you for the first question.
Hello, Tony, and hello, everyone, and thank you ever so much for this. These all excellent presentations, and all your work is really interesting, and yeah, I look forward to reading the book. So I just have two questions. One is the approach you took. So I understand it's a neo-Gramscian approach, and well, you call it critical political economy, which is obviously that. But I was wondering, what about critical liberal approaches? So why completely reject those, or do you actually use them in some of articles? I'm not sure when we have a feminist perspective if it's necessarily in a neo-Gramscian approach or a Marxist approach, or is it also classical liberal, but critical liberal approaches? So I just wanted to know how you fit with a critical liberal, if you just completely reject them, or if you incorporate them sometimes in the work. And the other question is just a curiosity to Alan Cafruny on Germany. I had the impression when you were giving your presentation that it was about actually saying that Germany is finished economically in the EU, but then the Foreign Affairs article is actually saying, no, Germany is a big danger. And so, well, which is it then? So maybe I misunderstood, but I had the impression actually that the two approaches were clashing. But as I said, so just to maybe elaborate a bit more on that. Thank you very much.
So thank you for that, Catherine. So, well, Alan can respond to the second question, but somebody needs to respond to the first one. So, Andreas, I don't know.
I think I can respond to the first one. I think it's not that critical liberal approaches are automatically rejected, but I think where the differences would be is that from a critical liberal approach, there's often this kind of, and I would refer to them as benign liberals, there's this kind of emphasis, well, actually, economically, things are working quite well. Ideally, we have a bit more market if we come from a neoliberal perspective, but we need to combine that with more redistributive measures in order to spread the benefits more equally across society. And I would argue from a critical political economy point of view, from a historic materialist point of view, we would argue that, well, this focuses too much on the sphere of circulation, on distribution, but the real exploitative dynamics are rooted within the way of how production is set up. And critical liberal perspectives wouldn't engage with that, as wouldn't critical liberal feminist approaches engage with this question of unpaid labor in the sphere of social reproduction. I think that's where then the differences are. But again, the exact positioning, that may well differ from individual contributor to individual contributor.
Thank you, Andreas. So, Alan, do you want to have a go at the second one?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't have time in 8 minutes to really be able to engage in the sort of dialectical understanding of this. But sure, Germany will remain a very significant, powerful country, both economically and increasingly militarily. But it doesn't look like Germany will ever return to those halcyon days of full employment, where it was really the industrial juggernaut in Europe, and in the world in some respects. If you look, say, at the automobile industry, it's just one example among many. So this is a dangerous situation because on the one hand, you have a very powerful country. On the other hand, you have a significant downturn, rise of alternatives for Germany and much else. And so that's something that's very, very important.
Okay, thank you, Alan. So do we have any more questions? I can't see any hands up. Well, whilst you're thinking, Amanda. Oh, brilliant. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I was going to come in. I'm just wondering, so Andreas, your chapter was on the Mercosur agreement. This is to you or anybody else really. What is the state of the transnational solidarity movement amongst trade unions that developed against the EU trade agreements about 20 years ago? I'm almost afraid to ask the question, but I'm hoping you know something wonderful that's kind of hiding in the wings. Thanks. Oh, and also, is there a paperback version coming out at some point?
So thanks a lot, Amanda. The paperback version is not 100% guaranteed, but it's not excluded either. There is a more affordable e-publication of the book. Yeah, that would be the first response of the publisher. I'm still old-fashioned. I like to have the hard volume in the hand. I think they realize that especially younger generation students predominantly have e-books when they engage with, and libraries get them. Yeah, so at the moment, the cheaper version would be the e-book. Yeah, but if you are, for example, interested in particular chapters, I think we can also organize that for you. Yeah, if you wanted that. So that's one thing. Then what about the labor solidarity, the transatlantic? And I would argue so there's a very strong Stop EU Mercosur alliance that does include environmental organizations, it includes social movements, it includes some trade unions from both sides of the Atlantic. But what is noticeable is that while there was a very solid trade union opposition to this new type of free trade deal when it comes to TTIP, which was supposed to be between the EU and the US and never came to fruition, or when it comes to CETA between the European Union and Canada, which is only provisional applied, has never been ratified. This kind of solid trade union opposition is no longer present when it comes to the EU Mercosur deal, because there are certain manufacturing sectors, especially car manufacturing and pharmaceuticals, which are hoping to benefit drastically from opening up Mercosur to their exports. And so especially German trade unions, the IG Metall, for example, metal workers, IG BC, chemical sector workers, they would be supportive of the agreement. And in that sense, this solidarity is not there. Of course, the treaty is hanging in the balance because the parliament has now voted to transfer to the European Court of Justice to see whether it's actually complying with the EU treaties. So it's still not being ratified, and the struggle there carries on.
Okay, thank you, Andreas, and thank you for your question, Amanda. So do we have any more? Can I ask Alan a question? Abuse my position as chair whilst everybody else is thinking of something that they would like to contribute. This is not my field, of course, but when I was listening to what you were saying, Alan, you mentioned inter-imperialist rivalry, and I immediately thought of when I was a student many years ago reading Ernest Mandel and his theory of the relationship between the EU and the United States, and his books on Europe versus America and late capitalism. So I'm just wondering, is Mandel still relevant today, do you think, or his theoretical framework in those works?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I actually, in my notes, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, there was Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, who in 1969 spoke of the American challenge to Europe. So this goes, there's a long history. Mandel, I think, saw Europe as emerging as a rival, whereas Nikos Poulantzas, I think, was probably closer to our view, and I think what's happened now, that was more in the Servan-Schreiber, that Europe is becoming more subordinated. So yeah, I think both those they are very relevant. Mandel was a brilliant scholar, as of course was Poulantzas, and I'll step out a little bit of my role here, but when Andreas was speaking about critical political economy, critical political economy scholarship has gotten Europe and the EU so right. When I think of the comparison, we talk about liberal scholarship, neo-functionalism, federalism, these theoretical perspectives just don't help us to understand what's taking place today.
Okay, thank you very much.
So I know that's a sort of editorial comment to make, but I think it's true.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, do we have any more? Oh, Elif, yes, thank you. Elif Özgoran.
Okay, thank you, Tony. My question is, I guess, to Andreas or Vincenzo. Congratulations for the book, and I'm also happy to contribute with the chapter and enlargement, and thanks for integrating me as well. Based on the observations and all the contributions, do you see some coordinates of an alternative socioeconomic order rising in Europe? Because all I can see in the official reports of EU is reform rule-based international system, and but not an alternative per se. But based on all the empirical work and all the discussions in the book, do you think we have some coordinates for an alternative, both structurally or regionally? But I don't know to whom to ask this question. Thank you.
Happy for Vincenzo to respond, if that's okay.
Thanks, Andreas. And of course, if the other contributors also want to jump in, please feel free to do so. Yeah, to be honest, at the moment, the outlook is rather pessimistic. When we had also a physical book launch in Florence, and I spoke about the more recent developments in the European Parliament, which essentially saw the end of the so-called cordon sanitaire between the Social Democrats and the European People's Party on certain legislation, including, for instance, the legislation on corporate sustainability due diligence. And so what we observe now is that the European People's Party, which is the main force in the European Parliament, and also, of course, has a great influence through its role in Germany, is now ready to pass legislation with the far right, with the hope that that will eventually stop the trickling of votes from to the far right parties, which I think it's of course a wrong prediction. But we're essentially observing an attack on social legislation driven by, again, renewed emphasis on competitiveness. And on this, of course, critical political economies of European integration has been very good in highlighting how this has always been a very powerful drive for business interest. The book by Bastian van Apeldoorn on European integration and the European single market being an example. So yeah, it doesn't seem, so this is what we are observing, and it doesn't seem that there is much of an alternative at the moment. It's also what Alan was saying, essentially the EU going just behind the US. So yeah, I to be honest, this is my not very optimistic take on this issue.
Okay, thank you, Vincenzo, and thank you for your question, Elif. So I have two, Catherine again, and then Sinem. Over to you, Catherine.
Okay, thank you. Now, I just had another question for Rosalind. When you gave your presentation, you defined social reproduction and you started with public spending and then unpaid labor. And I had the impression the rest of the presentation was mostly about the unpaid labor aspect. But I was just wondering about the public spending, education, healthcare. Isn't it a bit difficult to criticize the EU, because actually education is not a EU competence really, it's a state competence. So aren't there limits as well to what the EU can do because it's shared competences? Or what could it do then if we wanted it to have more of a public spending approach?
Okay. Rosalind.
So you're right, of course, that there are limits in terms of practice around subsidiarity. But there has always been a strong push from the EU to get more women into employment. And for example, there were like the Barcelona childcare targets, and this push for austerity has come from the EU. So although in terms of proactively, you could argue that the EU doesn't have any control of this because they don't control, for example, childcare policy or elder care policy. What is coming out of EU economic surveillance and monitoring is a very clear pressure against that kind of spending. So it's still something that feminists look at repeatedly, not least because the EU continues to tout itself as this feminist leader globally, which is simply not really, doesn't stand up anymore. And there are really strong push from the feminist movement to get more emphasis placed upon care because of the impact of austerity. So if you look kind of at the letter of the law, yes, you could say the EU has no control of this, but there are other mechanisms through which it exerts a very profound pressure on the social reproductive sector, which is why we continue to look at it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that, Catherine, and for your reply, Rosalind. Okay, we're running out of time, so perhaps this may well be the last question. Sinem, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tony. And that's really a very nice book, and it's really nice to hear all of the contributors or the presentations and the topics. I just want to ask to all of you, or maybe specific to Rosalind or whomever want to answer, just a general something that came to my mind, that I just completed and submitted an article about a political economy of anti-gender movements in Europe in general as a whole. And I've realized that they're all mostly tend to emerge after the economic crisis. And so I try to understand that, and they spread a lot, and they have a direct link with the far right groups and these increasing far right or extremist parties. So I try to understand started to question the role of the left and the missing points of the left, what they can't see. And because now we have, for instance, I'm in Germany, and AfD is increasing day by day, and there's an increase in these kind of groups, and as a civil society and as a political society. So where is left? What is the missing point? Shall they change the discourse or the practice or the activism methods? What do you think among this the role of left among this political crisis? Thank you.
Right, who's going to respond to that?
Well, I'll have a go as the fact. So, I mean, I think a couple of angles that I would take on this is the reason why the far left is so successful with, for example, anti-gender perspectives is because they're presenting a myth, right, of a previous time when things were better for certain people, and we all knew how it worked, and it was kind of this pre-bubolic much better. But it's a myth, but it's an emotionally powerful myth, and the left, and I would actually be interested in other people's perspectives on this here, because I think it extends slightly beyond what a feminist perspective or the kind of research circles that I would generally move in would talk about. But I don't see the left putting forward a compelling alternative. I mean, they are just in almost every country sort of meekly chasing after trying to take some sort of milquetoast version of a right-wing agenda, shoving a couple of bits of it into their manifesto and trying to keep people happy with that. The reasons why the left has been so lacking in vision and is just not able to come up with any kind of compelling alternative, that's actually not a question that I can answer. But I would certainly agree that to understand how the far right is being so successful, it's essential to look at the gender dynamics of it, because it offers a lifestyle or an image of the self to a group of people who expect certain degrees of privilege and who haven't been getting what they expect for quite a long time. So it's emotionally, it's so successful. But so I'm responding to the kind of emotional part of it the nuts and bolts of the political economy and why they're failing to come up with an alternative, I would really want to hear from the other presenters on their view on that.
And also, just a remark, just a reminder, they are using neoliberalism as a tool.
Yes,
but instead of criticizing economic liberalism, they are criticizing political liberalism, the rights. But they are using neoliberalism as a tool. How neoliberalism transformed the cells. So they are also, their main discourse is this. This is the point that I want to learn. What is the point of the left in here?
And they also, interestingly, particularly in places like Poland, frame feminism as a neoliberal agenda.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for that, Sinem, and for your reply, Rosalind. Right. Well, I'm afraid we have actually run out of